Imagine this. You're living your life, working hard every day to take care of your family. You love your wife. You've raised her daughter like she's your own blood. You've given them everything you have. And then one day, the two people you trust most in this world turn against you. They don't just leave you. They don't just break your heart. No, they do something so evil, so twisted, that it destroys your entire life. That's exactly what happened to Xavier Collins. This man spent 7 long years locked up in a cold, dark prison cell for a crime he didn't commit. 7 years. And who put him there? His own wife and the girl he raised as his daughter. But here's the thing about Xavier Collins. He's not the type of man who stays down when life knocks him to the ground. When he finally walked out of that prison, free as a bird, he had one thing on his mind: revenge. And what he did next will shock you to your core. This is a story about love, betrayal, lies, and ice-cold revenge. It's a story that shows us how the people closest to us can sometimes be the most dangerous. So buckle up, because this ride is going to get bumpy. Make sure you subscribe to Ruthless Realities for more stories that will keep you on the edge of your seat. And stick around until the end, because you're going to want to hear every single detail of how this story ends. Let me tell you about Xavier Collins. Picture a man who gets up every morning before the sun comes up. He puts on his work boots, grabs his hard hat, and heads out to build houses and fix buildings around Atlanta, Georgia. Xavier was what you call a real man's man: strong hands, broad shoulders, and a heart bigger than the state of Texas. Xavier was 38 years old when our story really begins. But he'd been working construction since he was barely old enough to drive. He believed in doing things the right way. Work hard, treat people with respect, and always keep your word. That's how his daddy raised him, and that's how he lived his life. When Xavier met Brianna Powell at a church barbecue on a hot summer day in Atlanta, something clicked. She was beautiful, with long dark hair and a smile that could light up a room. But more than that, she seemed like she needed someone to take care of her. Brianna was 36 years old and had been through some tough times. She grew up in a house where love was hard to find. Her parents fought all the time, and she never really learned what a healthy relationship looked like. She had a daughter named Aries, who was just 10 years old at the time. Aries was a sweet little girl with big brown eyes and pigtails that bounced when she ran around the playground. When Xavier met little Aries, his heart melted like butter on hot toast. This little girl didn't have a daddy in her life, and Xavier saw an opportunity to be the father figure she needed. From day one, he treated Aries like she was his own flesh and blood. He taught her how to ride a bike, helped her with her homework, and tucked her into bed at night with stories about princesses and dragons. The three of them became a family faster than you could snap your fingers. Xavier and Brianna got married in a small ceremony at their local church. It wasn't fancy, but it was filled with love and hope for the future. They moved into a nice house in a quiet neighborhood, where kids played in the streets and neighbors waved at each other from their front porches. For the first few years, everything seemed perfect. Xavier would come home from work tired and dusty, but Brianna would have dinner waiting on the table. Little Aries would run to the door screaming, "Daddy's Xavier," and jump into his arms. They were living the American dream. But you know what they say about dreams. Sometimes you wake up and realize it was all just an illusion. As the years went by, things started to change in the Collins household. It happened slowly at first, like water dripping through a crack in the ceiling. You don't notice it right away, but eventually, that little drip becomes a flood that destroys everything. Brianna began to show a side of herself that Xavier had never seen before. She started getting angry over little things. If Xavier left his work boots by the front door, she'd scream at him for 20 minutes. If he wanted to watch a football game on Sunday, she'd accuse him of not caring about the family. Nothing he did was ever good enough. The arguments got louder and more frequent. Brianna would call Xavier names that would make a sailor blush. She'd tell him he was stupid, that he was worthless, that she could do better than a construction worker who came home covered in dirt every day. These words cut deeper than any knife ever could. Xavier tried to be patient. He told himself that Brianna was just stressed, that maybe she was having a hard time adjusting to married life. He loved her, and he loved Aries. So He kept trying to make things work. But love can only take so much punishment before it starts to break. Meanwhile, Aries was growing up. She went from a sweet 10-year-old to a young woman who was struggling to find her way in life. By the time she turned 21, she was still living at home with Xavier and Brianna because she couldn't seem to hold down a steady job or stick with college. Xavier loved Aries like his own daughter, so he was patient with her struggles. When she dropped out of community college after just one semester, Xavier encouraged her to try again. When she got fired from her job at the grocery store for showing up late too many times, Xavier helped her find another job. He believed in her, even when she didn't believe in herself. But Brianna always made excuses for Aries' behavior. She's just finding herself. Brianna would say whenever Xavier tried to encourage Aries to be more responsible. Not everyone needs to follow the same path in life, Xavier. You're being too hard on her. The truth was, Aries was being pulled in two different directions. Part of her loved the stable, safe life that Xavier provided. She appreciated how he never gave up on her, how he was always there to support her when things went wrong. But another part of her was drawn to the excitement and danger that came with her biological father's world. You see, Aries' real dad had never completely disappeared from her life. His name was Marcus, and he was what you might call a street entrepreneur. That's a nice way of saying he made his money doing things that weren't exactly legal. Marcus would show up every few months with expensive gifts for Aries, designer clothes, jewelry, the latest phone, telling her stories about the exciting life he lived and how much money she could make if she came to work with him. Your stepfather is a good man, Marcus would tell Aries during his visits. But he's never going to be able to give you the finer things in life. He's always going to be just a construction worker living paycheck to paycheck. But with me, you could have anything you want. Xavier could see that Aries was being tempted by her father's lifestyle. But every time he tried to warn her about the dangers of that world, Brianna would shut him down. Marcus is her father, Xavier. Brianna would say she has a right to have a relationship with him. As Aries got older, she started staying out late, being secretive about where she was going and who she was with. She would sleep until noon, then sit around the house all day watching TV or scrolling through her phone. Xavier tried to encourage her to get a job or go back to school, but Brianna would always defend her daughter's choices. The house that had once been filled with laughter and love was now filled with tension and anger. Xavier felt like he was walking on eggshells every single day. He never knew what might set Brianna off, and he was watching the girl he loved like his own daughter slip away from him. But Xavier is a fighter. He didn't give up easily. He kept trying to hold his family together, even as everything around him was falling apart. He had no idea that the two people he loved most were about to betray him in the worst way possible. After 11 years of marriage, Xavier thought he had seen the worst of Brianna's behavior. He was wrong, dead wrong. It was a Thursday afternoon in March when Xavier's world came crashing down like a house of cards in a hurricane. He had finished work early because the concrete they were supposed to pour that day hadn't been delivered. Instead of calling Brianna to let her know he was coming home, Xavier decided to surprise her. Maybe they could have a nice, quiet afternoon together. Just the two of them. Xavier pulled into his driveway and noticed a car he didn't recognize parked across the street. He didn't think much of it at first. New neighbors were always moving in and out of the area. He grabbed his lunchbox from the passenger seat and walked up to his front door, keys jingling in his hand. The moment Xavier opened that door, his heart stopped beating. There, on his own couch in his own living room, was his wife, Brianna, kissing another woman. Not just a friendly kiss on the cheek, but the kind of kiss meant for lovers. Xavier stood there, frozen like a statue, unable to move or speak. His brain couldn't process what his eyes were seeing. The woman Brianna was with that short blonde hair and was wearing clothes that cost more money than Xavier made in a month. When Brianna finally looked up and saw Xavier standing in the doorway, she didn't look ashamed or sorry. She looked angry, like Xavier had done something wrong by coming into his own house. "Xavier," she shouted, jumping up from the couch. "What are you doing here?" "I live here," Xavier said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. "This is my house. Brianna, what's going on?" The blonde woman grabbed her purse and rushed toward the back door without saying a word. Brianna followed her, whispering something in her ear before the woman disappeared into the backyard. When Brianna came back into the living room, her whole attitude had changed. Now, she looked like a completely different person, cold, mean, and ready for a fight. "Don't you dare judge me, Xavier," she said, pointing her finger at him like a weapon. "You have no idea what it's like being married to someone like you." "Someone like me?" Xavier repeated, still trying to understand what was happening. "Brianna, I've given you everything. I've worked my fingers to the bone to provide for you and Aries. I've loved you both like you were my whole world." "Your love isn't enough," Brianna screamed. "I need more than what you can give me. I need excitement, passion, adventure. All you know how to do is work and come home tired." Those words hit Xavier like a punch to the stomach. For 11 years, he had gotten up every morning and gone to work, not because he loved construction, but because he loved his family. Every blister on his hands, every ache in his back, every drop of sweat he shed was for them. "So, how long has this been going on?" Xavier asked, trying to keep his voice calm. "Does it matter?" Brianna shot back. "The point is, I'm done pretending to be happy in this marriage. I want a divorce, Xavier. I want you out of my house." "Your house?" Xavier couldn't believe what he was hearing. "I've been paying the mortgage on this house for 11 years. I put the down payment on this house with money I saved working overtime. Well, now it's going to be my house," Brianna said with a smile that was colder than ice. "My lawyer says I'm entitled to half of everything, plus alimony, plus child support for Aries." That's when Xavier realized that this wasn't just about Brianna finding someone new. This was planned. She had been thinking about this for a while, maybe even years. The woman he had loved and trusted had been plotting behind his back. "Where's Aries?" Xavier asked, suddenly realizing that his stepdaughter wasn't home yet. "She's upstairs in her room," Brianna said. "She's been there all afternoon. And when I tell her what kind of man you really are, she's going to understand why I'm leaving you." Xavier didn't know what that meant, but something in Brianna's voice made his blood run cold. There was something evil in her eyes, something that hadn't been there before. Or maybe it had always been there, and Xavier had been too blind to see it. Over the next few weeks, Xavier moved out of the house and into a small apartment across town. The divorce proceedings began, and just like Brianna had predicted, her lawyer was trying to take everything Xavier had worked for his entire adult life. But the worst part wasn't losing his house or his money. The worst part was losing Aries. The young woman who used to look up to him like he was her hero now barely spoke to him when he came to pick her up for his court-ordered visitation days. Brianna had poisoned Aries' mind against him, filling her head with lies about what kind of man Xavier was. She told Aries that Xavier had never really loved her, that he had only pretended to care about her to get close to Brianna. None of it was true, but Aries was 21 now and still struggling to figure out her place in the world. She was confused and hurt by her parents' divorce, and it was easier to believe her mother's lies than to face the complicated truth. Xavier tried to explain his side of the story to Aries, but she wouldn't listen. During their awkward visits, she would just stare at her phone or find an excuse to leave early. When Xavier asked her about her job search or college plans, she would just shrug and say she was figuring things out. Meanwhile, Xavier started noticing that Aries was hanging around with some very dangerous people. During one of their visits, he saw her getting dropped off by a car full of young men who looked like they were up to no good. The car was expensive, too expensive for people her age to afford legally, and the men inside had the hard look of people who had seen too much violence. When Xavier asked Aries about it, she just rolled her eyes and told him it was none of his business. "Aries, I'm worried about you," Xavier said one Saturday afternoon when they were supposed to be having lunch together at a small diner near his apartment. "Those people you're hanging around with, they don't look like the kind of people who are going to help you build a good life." "You don't know anything about my life." Aries snapped back. "You're not my real father, remember? You don't get to tell me what to do anymore." Those words felt like a dagger through Xavier's heart. For 11 years, he had been the only father Aries had known. He had taught her to tie her shoes, helped her with her math homework, scared away the monsters under her bed, and stayed up all night when she was sick with a fever. But now, she was acting like none of that mattered. Aries, I know I'm not your biological father, Xavier said softly, trying to keep his voice calm, even though his heart was breaking. But I love you like you're my own daughter. I always have, and I always will. That doesn't change just because your mother and I are getting divorced. Whatever, Aries said, but Xavier could see tears forming in her eyes. Deep down, he knew she was hurting just as much as he was. The divorce had torn apart the only stable family she had ever known, and she was dealing with that pain in the worst possible way. What Xavier didn't know was that Aries was getting pulled deeper and deeper into her biological father's world. Marcus had been telling her stories about the money she could make and the respect she could earn if she joined him in his business ventures. He made it sound exciting and easy, just a few simple jobs, and she could make more money in a month than Xavier made in a year. At 21 years old, Aries was old enough to make her own decisions, but still young enough to make really bad ones. She was tired of being broke, tired of watching her friends drive nice cars and wear expensive clothes while she was stuck living at home with no clear direction for her future. So, when Marcus offered her a chance to make some real money, Aries said yes. She started running small errands for Marcus and his associates. Nothing too serious at first, just delivering packages or messages from one person to another. She didn't ask what was in the packages, and Marcus didn't volunteer the information. But soon, Aries was in deeper than she ever intended to be. The packages got bigger. The destinations got more dangerous. And the people she was dealing with got scarier. By the time she realized what she had gotten herself into, it was too late to back out. Marcus had gotten himself into some serious trouble with some very dangerous people. He had been trusted to handle a large shipment of drugs and a briefcase full of cash. But instead of delivering them to their intended destination, he had stolen everything and disappeared. The people he stole from were not the forgiving type, and they wanted their property back, with interest. When they couldn't find Marcus, they started looking for his family. That meant Aries was in danger, and Brianna knew it. She also knew that if these dangerous people discovered her daughter had been helping Marcus with his illegal activities, they would assume Aries knew where the stolen money and drugs were hidden. That's when Brianna came up with a plan, one so evil, so twisted, that it would destroy an innocent man's life just to save her daughter's. She was going to frame Xavier Collins. It was a Friday night in September when Brianna put her plan into action. She called Xavier and asked him to come over to the house to pick up some of his belongings that she had found while cleaning out the garage. "I found some of your tools that got mixed in with my stuff," Brianna said over the phone, her voice sounding surprisingly sweet for someone who had been nothing but hostile during their divorce proceedings. "And there are some photo albums, pictures of you and Aries when she was little. I thought you might want to keep them." Xavier was suspicious. Brianna hadn't been nice to him in months, and suddenly she was calling to give him sentimental photos? Something didn't feel right, but Xavier missed his old life so much that he was willing to take any excuse to see Aries and maybe try to repair their damaged relationship. "Okay," Xavier said cautiously. "What time works for you? How about 8 o'clock tonight?" Brianna suggested. "Ari will be here too. She's been having a hard time with the divorce, and I think it would be good for her to see that we can all be civil with each other." Xavier's heart jumped with hope. Maybe this was Brianna's way of extending an olive branch. Maybe she was finally ready to put their differences aside for Aries' sake. Maybe, just maybe, they could work out some kind of arrangement where he could still be part of his stepdaughter's life, without all the drama and hostility. "That sounds great," Xavier said. "I'll be there at 8. Xavier arrived at the house at exactly 8 o'clock, carrying a bottle of wine as a peace offering. When Brianna opened the door, she was dressed like she was going to a fancy dinner party. Her hair was done, her makeup was perfect, and she was wearing a dress that Xavier had bought her for their anniversary 2 years ago. "Come in," Brianna said with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Aries is in the living room waiting for us." Xavier walked into the house that had been his home for over a decade. Everything looked exactly the same, but somehow it felt completely different. It felt cold, unwelcoming, like he was a stranger walking into someone else's house. Aries was sitting on the couch, but she didn't get up to hug him like she used to. She just nodded in his direction and kept staring at her phone. "Hey, sweetheart," Xavier said, sitting down in his old recliner. "How have you been?" "Fine," Aries answered without looking up. For the next hour, the three of them sat in the living room, making awkward small talk. Brianna asked about Xavier's new apartment, his work, and whether he was dating anyone. Xavier answered her questions politely, but he kept wondering when she was going to give him his belongings so he could leave. "Actually, Xavier," Brianna said around 9 o'clock, "there's something I need to talk to you about. Something important." "Okay," Xavier said, leaning forward in his chair. "What is it?" "I know you've been watching me," Brianna said, her voice suddenly turning cold. "Following me around, trying to catch me with other people." Xavier was confused. "What are you talking about, Brianna? I haven't been following you anywhere." "Don't lie to me," Brianna shouted, jumping up from the couch. "My friends have seen you parked outside my work, outside the grocery store, outside my sister's house." "Brianna, I swear to you, I have not been following you," Xavier said, standing up too. "I don't know who your friends think they saw, but it wasn't me. You're obsessed with me." Brianna continued, screaming. "You can't stand the fact that I'm happy without you. You want to control me, just like you always have." Xavier looked over at Aries, hoping she would help him make sense of what was happening. But Aries was no longer looking at her phone. She was staring at both of them, with an expression Xavier had never seen before. "Aries, you know I'm not stalking your mother," Xavier said. "Tell her that's not the kind of person I am." But Aries didn't say anything. She just kept staring. That's when Brianna walked over to the end table next to the couch and opened the drawer. Xavier's heart stopped when he saw what she pulled out. It was his old pistol, the one he had bought years ago to keep in the house for protection. "Brianna, what are you doing with that?" Xavier asked, his voice shaking. "You left this here when you moved out," Brianna said, holding the gun like she knew exactly how to use it. "I was going to give it back to you tonight, along with your other stuff." Xavier took a step toward her. "Okay, just hand it to me and let's." "Stay back," Brianna screamed, pointing the gun toward the ceiling. "Don't come any closer." "Brianna, please put the gun down," Xavier said, holding his hands up. "You're scaring me and you're scaring Aries." That's when everything went crazy. Brianna, in what looked like a fit of rage, started waving the gun around wildly. She was screaming about how Xavier had ruined her life, how he had trapped her in a loveless marriage, how she wished she had never met him. Xavier was terrified that the gun might go off accidentally and hurt someone. So he did what any reasonable person would do. He tried to get the gun away from her before someone got hurt. "Give me the gun, Brianna," Xavier shouted, reaching for her hand. They struggled for what felt like hours, but it was probably only a few seconds. The gun was pointing up toward the ceiling, then toward the wall, then toward the floor. Xavier was trying to get his fingers around Brianna's wrist so he could take the gun away from her safely. And then it happened. Bang! The gun went off. Brianna screamed like she was being attacked by a wild animal. She dropped the gun and grabbed her hand, blood seeping through her fingers. "Oh my God!" Xavier shouted. "Brianna, are you okay?" But Brianna wasn't looking at her hand. She was looking at Aries, with an expression that Xavier would never forget. It was like they were communicating without words, like they had planned this whole thing from the beginning. "Aries, call 911. Brianna screamed. "He tried to kill me. Xavier tried to kill me." Xavier couldn't believe what he was hearing. "What?" "No. Brianna, it was an accident. You know it was an accident." But Aries was already on the phone with the emergency operator, and the words coming out of her mouth made Xavier's blood run cold. "Please help us," Aries said into the phone, her voice shaking with fake tears. "My stepfather just shot my mother. He said he was going to kill both of us. Please hurry." Xavier stood there in the middle of his old living room, staring at the two people he had loved more than life itself, and realized he had been set up. This whole thing had been planned from the very beginning. "Brianna, tell them the truth," Xavier pleaded. "Tell them it was an accident. Tell them you had the gun first." But Brianna just kept screaming about how Xavier had tried to murder her. And Aries kept telling the 911 operator that Xavier was dangerous, that he had been threatening them for weeks. When the police arrived 5 minutes later, they found Xavier standing over Brianna with a smoking gun at his feet and blood on his hands. To them, it looked like an open and shut case of domestic violence gone wrong. They arrested Xavier Collins on the spot and charged him with attempted murder. The trial was a nightmare that Xavier couldn't wake up from. Brianna and Aries sat on the witness stand and lied under oath, telling the jury that Xavier had come to the house that night with the intention of killing them both. They said Xavier had been stalking Brianna for months. They said he had threatened to kill her if she didn't take him back. They said he had brought his own gun to the house that night and pulled it out during an argument, pointing at both of them before Brianna tried to defend herself. But here's where Brianna's planning showed just how clever and evil she really was. Before Xavier had arrived that night, Brianna had wiped down the entire gun with a cloth, removing any old fingerprints. Then she had carefully held the gun using a kitchen towel, making sure her fingers never touched the metal directly. When Xavier wrestled the gun away from her during their struggle, his bare hands gripped the weapon tightly, leaving clear fingerprints all over it. But because Brianna had been careful to use the towel, there was no evidence that she had ever touched the gun at all. To the police and the jury, it looked like Xavier had brought the gun to the house and been the only one to handle it. Brianna and Aries testified that Xavier had threatened them with a weapon, and when Brianna tried to defend herself, the gun had gone off during the struggle. Xavier's lawyer tried his best to poke holes in their story, but Brianna and Aries had their lies down pat. They had practiced their story until it sounded believable, and the physical evidence seemed to support their version of events. Xavier's fingerprints were all over the gun. There was gunpowder residue on his hands from the struggle. Brianna had a bullet wound that required surgery. What the jury didn't know was that Brianna and Aries had spent weeks planning this setup. They had choreographed the whole thing like a deadly dance, making sure that all the evidence would point to Xavier, and Xavier alone. The plan to frame Xavier had been Brianna's idea from the very beginning. When Marcus had stolen the money and disappeared, Brianna knew that the dangerous people he had crossed would eventually come looking for his family. She needed a way to make Aries look like a victim instead of an accomplice. Brianna had been planning the setup for months before that night in September. She had been telling people that Xavier was stalking her, that he was threatening her, that she was afraid he might try to hurt her. She was building a case against him long before she ever called him to come to the house that night. The gun had been loaded and ready. Brianna had even cut her own hand with a knife earlier that day, creating a small wound that she could make worse with a gunshot. She knew exactly where to position herself, so that when the gun went off, the bullet would graze the existing cut and make it look like Xavier had shot her. Aries had been coached on exactly what to say to the 911 operator and exactly how to act when the police arrived. They had rehearsed their story over and over until it was perfect, until every detail supported the lie that Xavier had come to the house armed and dangerous. The saddest part was that Aries had never wanted to do it. She loved Xavier and knew he was a good man who had never done anything to hurt her or her mother. But Brianna had convinced her that it was the only way to save her life. "My mother told me that if we didn't do this, I would end up like my father," Aries would later explain. "She said that the people who were after us would torture me to death trying to get information I didn't have." The jury found Xavier Collins guilty of attempted murder in the first degree. The judge sentenced him to 12 years in prison, but with good behavior, he might be eligible for parole in 7 years. As the bailiff put handcuffs on Xavier's wrists and led him away, he looked back at Brianna and Aries one last time. Brianna was dabbing her eyes with a tissue, pretending to cry. But Aries was looking right at him, and instead of the regret he hoped to see, her eyes were cold and hard. "You're not my father," Aries shouted as the guards led Xavier toward the door. "You never were. I'm glad they're sending you away." Those words cut deeper than any knife could have. The little girl he had raised, loved, and protected had completely turned against him. In that moment, Xavier realized that both Brianna and Aries had planned this betrayal together. There was no innocence left in either of them. Prison was everything Xavier had feared it would be, and worse. He was surrounded by dangerous men who had done terrible things. The food was awful. The guards were cruel. And every single day felt like it lasted a year. But the worst part about prison wasn't the violence, the loneliness, or the terrible conditions. The worst part was knowing that he was innocent, that the two people he had loved most in the world had betrayed him in the cruelest way possible. And unlike what he'd hoped, Aries hadn't been manipulated by her mother. She had been a willing participant in destroying his life. For the first few years, Xavier spent most of his time planning his revenge. He wasn't just angry. He was consumed with hatred. Every night, he would lie in his narrow prison bunk and imagine what he would do to Brianna and Aries when he got out. The thoughts of revenge were the only thing that kept him going during the darkest moments. But after a while, Xavier realized that just being angry wasn't enough. If he wanted real revenge, he needed to be smart about it. He needed to become someone Brianna and Aries would never expect him to be. So, Xavier used his time behind bars to transform himself. He got his high school diploma, then his college degree. He read every book in the prison library, especially books about law, psychology, and criminal justice. He worked out every single day until he was in the best shape of his life. He learned Spanish, French, and even a little bit of Mandarin Chinese. Most importantly, Xavier spent his time building connections with other inmates. He learned about people who could help him when he got out, people who knew how to find information, people who could make things happen, people who understood that sometimes the law isn't enough to get real justice. Xavier also spent his time thinking about what had really happened that night. The more he thought about it, the more convinced he became that this wasn't just about protecting Aries from her father's enemies. There was something bigger going on, something that Brianna and Aries were hiding. Through letters and phone calls from other inmates' contacts on the outside, Xavier learned pieces of information about what was happening in the real world. He discovered that Marcus had been killed in a police shootout just 2 years after Xavier went to prison. But the stolen money was never recovered, which meant someone else had it. Xavier began to suspect that Brianna and Aries hadn't just framed him to protect themselves. They had framed him because they knew where Marcus's stolen money was hidden, and they needed Xavier out of the way so they could claim it for themselves. That's when Xavier's plan for revenge became crystal clear. He wasn't just going to hurt them. He was going to destroy their entire lives, just like they had destroyed his. On a cold Tuesday morning in February, Xavier Collins walked out of prison a free man. He was 45 years old now, with gray in his hair and lines on his face that hadn't been there when he went in. But his body was like a machine, and his mind was sharper than a razor blade. Xavier had saved every penny he could get his hands on during his time in prison, and he had also made some very useful connections. Some of the men he had met inside knew people on the outside, people who could help with things that couldn't be done through normal legal channels. The first thing Xavier did was rent a small apartment in a different part of Atlanta from where he used to live. He didn't want anyone recognizing him or asking where he'd been for 7 years. Xavier got a construction job for cover, but his real work started at night, hunting information about Brianna and Aries. What he discovered made his blood boil. While he rotted in prison, they'd been living like royalty in an expensive house, driving luxury cars, taking exotic vacations. The shocking truth? Marcus had been killed in a police shootout 2 years after Xavier's imprisonment, but not before telling Brianna and Aries where he'd hidden the stolen money. They recovered it and lived off blood money ever since. But Xavier discovered something that made his revenge even sweeter. Aries had been bragging at parties about their perfect crime. She called Xavier a stupid fool, laughing about her fake tears fooling the jury. These weren't scared people who made mistakes. They were evil criminals who enjoyed destroying his life and felt proud of it. Xavier spent months studying them, learning their weaknesses. Brianna had gambling debts to dangerous people. Aries used drugs and had an abusive boyfriend. Most importantly, police were investigating Marcus's missing money. Time to make his move. But Xavier's revenge wouldn't be quick. He'd destroy them piece by piece. Xavier's plan was elaborate and devastating. He used their greed and criminal behavior to destroy them from within. First, he spread word through prison connections that someone was asking about Marcus's money. This rumor reached the original hunters, the same criminals Brianna and Aries had feared years earlier. Soon, those dangerous people were back in the picture, demanding answers about money Brianna and Aries had already spent. While they panicked, Xavier gathered evidence of their lavish lifestyle, documenting how they afforded luxury on no reported income. He sent anonymous tips to the police, IRS, and FBI, with photos of their house, cars, jewelry, and vacation receipts, alongside tax returns showing almost no income. Xavier's masterstroke came through his network of informants, witnesses who had heard Brianna and Aries brag about their crimes at parties and social gatherings. Multiple people came forward, willing to testify about hearing them laugh about framing Xavier and calling him a stupid fool. Most importantly, Xavier provided authorities with detailed information about Marcus's criminal activities and the location of evidence that would prove Brianna and Aries had been living off stolen money. That gave law enforcement probable cause to obtain search warrants and surveillance orders. Once the FBI had legal authority, they recorded Brianna and Aries discussing their crimes, capturing admissible evidence of them talking about framing Xavier and hiding the money. Xavier's patience and careful planning ensured everything was done legally, making the evidence bulletproof in court. Within 48 hours, the FBI arrested both women. The trial lasted 6 weeks. Xavier attended every day, watching their own words condemn them. Brianna got 25 years for money laundering, tax evasion, and conspiracy. The judge called it one of the most callous acts this court has seen. Aries received 11 years, despite being younger when the crimes began. Marcus's truth finally emerged, killed in that police shootout, but only after revealing the money's location to Brianna and Aries. Xavier's conviction remained, but he didn't care about official vindication. He had gotten something better, pure revenge, outside the courthouse. Xavier told the media, 7 years ago, I lost my life to 2 people who chose greed over truth. Today, they're paying the price. When asked about sympathy for Aries, Xavier replied coldly, she chose when she said, I was never her father. Actions have consequences. 3 years later, Xavier received Aries' prison letter, begging forgiveness, describing harsh treatment from inmates who knew she had framed an innocent man. Xavier threw it away without hesitation. Some betrayals are too calculated for forgiveness. Aries had chosen to enjoy the benefits of the frame job, bragged about fooling juries, and rejected him as a father. Later, Xavier heard Brianna was attacked in prison by inmates who despised those who sent innocent men to jail. He felt no sympathy. They had destroyed 7 years of his life without hesitation or regret. Now 50, Xavier built a successful business and married someone who admired his strength. Brianna might get parole at 61. If she survives, Aries will be released at 43, a convicted felon with no skills and no support. Sometimes justice takes time, but when it comes, it's more satisfying than quick revenge. Could you have waited 7 years for justice? How would you handle betrayal by the people you love most? Subscribe for more stories of justice and revenge. This is Ruthless Realities. Until next time.